Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you guys had a great long weekend, and welcome back. Could you go ahead and give me some green check marks, please, if you can hear me and see me, and let me know you're there, ready to go. Got one. Excellent. A few people are asking questions in chat about tomorrow at OC. So Okanagan College, I don't know if Mrs. Wood has said anything about it or not, and I hesitate to tell you a bunch about it because I don't know that much, but my understanding is that we're meeting at Okanagan College, which is on KLO Road in Kelowna, at 9 o'clock. Everything starts at 9:15. So basically you just need to show up at the front entrance, kind of main foyer off KLO Road, and then at 9. And then we're going to get everyone together. We're going to kind of break you guys off into groups depending on what sessions you want to go to, so we'll let you know where everything is. And then we'll meet back for lunch. We're going to have some pizza for lunch, I think, and that's provided for you. And then the day should end around 3 o'clock, so you don't really need to bring anything, maybe something to write with, and I don't know, whatever you might need in terms of snacks and maybe a water bottle. But other than that, you should be set up pretty good. If you just show up, we should be okay. So 9 o'clock at OC on KLO Road, and then pick up at about 3 o'clock when the day is kind of done. So I don't know a ton more than that. That's kind of all I know, and take it for what it's worth. So hopefully we'll see everyone there. It looks like there is a few people without green check marks, and I just want to make sure that you are there and you're with us, and you can hear me and see me. Anna's asking about just like a notebook and a water bottle. Yeah, that should be plenty. And I mean, even if you had just a pen or pencil, I'm sure if there's something important, they'll give you like a handout or something so you can just write on it. So if you had a pen, that would probably be a good start. And then, I mean, if you get thirsty, bring a water bottle. Always a good idea to have it. You should be good. So that's kind of the first thing. A few more checks, which is great. The second thing is the safety unit. We should be done now. About half of you have submitted it. I'm not really sure why the other half haven't. Realistically, it probably was maybe an hour of your time to finish the learning guide and that quiz. If you had submitted the learning guide over the weekend, unfortunately I wasn't at my computer yesterday, and I saw them this morning. There was probably about 5 or so learning guides that had been submitted, and you need to make sure you get those in. If you submitted it over the weekend, I'll get to it, and you should probably before lunch today, and then I'll have that password sent out. If you're not done, let me know why. I'm not sure. Just keep me in the loop if something's going on. Let me know, but it's pretty straightforward stuff. So I'm gonna actually just close the unit at the end of the week. If you're not done it, then I guess you're just not doing it. It's really no reason it should take you more than a week to do. So either you're not doing the work or you just don't care. I'm not sure. But needless to say, a bit disappointed that they all aren't submitted. If you aren't getting that little amount of work done, it's not likely you're going to get the actual material done that we're doing. So a bit worried there, but I'm probably talking to a bunch of people who did it anyway. So I apologize if you submitted it and did the test and everything. Or I call it a test, it's a quiz. I think it was like 9 questions, and it was really straightforward. So there you go. The second thing I want to talk about is where we left off with the biology section. So we had been talking about biomes a little bit, how we defined what biomes were, what sort of factors we included to kind of outline where they were. And then we got to 2 main abiotic factors. And remember, abiotic means non-living, so non-living factors. And the 2 big ones were temperature and precipitation. And we can use a graph to kind of define what temperature and precipitation for an area looks like, and we call those climatographs. So basically, if you take averages over really long periods of time, suggests in the book about 30 years or so, and you plot the average amount of precipitation and you plot the average temperature on the same graph, it's called a climatograph. And in the learning guide, there was actually an example for us to go through. So I wanted to do that today, but before we do that, we'll just look at these two examples. So these are both climatographs for areas of British Columbia, one for Tofino on the west coast of the island, and one for Osoyoos, both 49 degrees latitude. And you can see that obviously the bars here represent way more rain for Tofino than Osoyoos. So the Osoyoos area here, very little precipitation. But you can see the temperature profiles are fairly similar. You have temperatures that are on average between 15 and 5 degrees year round. Osoyoos, you can get a little bit higher temperatures. You go from average from about 0 to 25. Of course, you're going to have days that are hotter than 25 degrees. In the summer we have lots of days that are 30 plus degrees. But remember, these are averages over long periods of time. So it's not the temperature precipitation on one day, it's an average over 30 years. So it's going to take averages into account. You can see the months along the bottom, January through December, precipitation on the left, temperature on the right. It's pretty straightforward, but plotting them can be a bit tricky. Trying to get your information to fill up the full graph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to the learning guide, and then we're going to look at the example we're given. I think it's Kamloops or something like that. And we're going to together go through this. Is there any place that has 5 liters of rain per year? I'm sure Kelowna gets 5 liters. 5 meters, probably. East coast of Canada, you would. Rainforests would get more than 5 meters a year for sure. Yeah, there's lots of places that probably would get that much. All right, so, sorry, it wasn't Kamloops, it was Prince Rupert. And these are the numbers for Prince Rupert. You can see we have temperature average from about 5 degrees in the winter to, it looks like about 16 in the summer. And then precipitation, we have a low of, what's the smallest one here? I guess 114 is our smallest one, and then we have up to 379 will be our biggest. So when we plot graphs, it's always a good idea to know your smallest and your largest values, so you can put those on your axis. You have to account for all of those. So this is from your learning guide for Unit 1. I'm going to just go through it kind of with you. So here we go. We have a blank graph, and we need to fill out the information on the previous page on the graph. So your graph doesn't necessarily need to look exactly like mine, but it should be, similar. So what we want to do is a few things. First, we should give our graph a title. So let's do that. Climatograph for Prince Rupert. Black. All right, climatograph for Prince Rupert. There we go. So along the bottom, I'll just draw a line here. Remember, there's 12 months in a year, so we want kind of 12 divisions along there. How many do we have? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So what I'm going to do is, 12 is about midway here. So what I'm going to do is do 2 squares represents 1 month. So I'll draw a little line here, and I'll call that January. Another one is February, March, April, May, June, and July. I get a bit confusing, 2 J's, but you'll figure it out. August, September, October, November, December. There we go. So across the bottom, kind of fits nicely there. Now, on the left side, we're going to have our vertical axis here. Draw a line up. And then on the right side, we're gonna have the same thing, so I'm gonna just draw them both at the same time. And I'm gonna put rainfall in millimeters on the left side. And then I'm gonna have temperature in degrees Celsius over here. Do that. All right. So if we go back to our rainfall values on the previous page, again, the precipitation ranges from about 114 is the lowest, and then 379 was the highest. So the highest value is about 400, let's say, we'll call it 400. So we need to break this left side into 400. So what's that? 50, 100, 50, 200. I'm just going to draw a line every 2 bars, and then we'll see if we can break it into something that makes a bit of sense. So I'm going to want 400 to be somewhere around here, just to utilize as much of that graph as possible. So if I did, if I went up by 50s, that's 100, 50, 200, 50, 300, 50, 400. I'm pretty happy with that. That's using a lot of the graph. And then we could have 500 up here, and then 600 we're not going to get to. So that's going to be good for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw my precipitation values as blue lines, and we're going to use bars. So think of when you draw a climatograph, you want each bar to kind of be representative of how much precipitation fell. And bars kind of make sense because if you had just like a cup sitting outside, you can imagine the cup filling up with water, and then, you know, at the top of the cup, that's how much rainfall you got for that month. So it looks like January is 256.9. So we'll just call it 257. So I'm going to find 250, and I'm just going to go right above 250. And then there we go. That's 257 is my first line there. I can draw a bar down if I want. I can color it in if I have some nice crayons, something pretty at home. If you don't have fancy colors, don't worry about it. Just do what you can. Shade it in with pencils, fine. All right, so that's January. I'm going to go to February. It's 203. So the next one over is February. It's about 203, so really close to 200. Draw a line down. There we go. Fill it in. And then we're going to go to March. It's 191. All right, so it's 150, so 190 is about there. And you're going to do that for all of those values, so it's going to go all the way across. And usually it'll kind of do this sort of thing. You get a dry part of the year and a rainy part of the year. So I'm not going to, waste your time drawing all of those bars. I'm sure you could figure out the rest. If you can't, let me know. Let's look at the temperature here for a second. Let's see if we can plot some of these temperature values on here, at least get our axis set up. Now, normally when we draw a graph, we have something on the left side, and then we have something across the bottom, and that's it. But on climatographs, we have sort of two things being read at once. We have an axis for the precipitation, we have an axis for the temperature, and then the month of the year along the bottom. So temperature can be a bit tricky. As I stated before, we're going from about, what was the lowest? 4.6 to 16. So we want our values to be between 4 and 16. And if we look at the examples, here's an example. You can see the temperature values, they can overlap the precipitation values. That's fine if you try to use two different colors or maybe a darker line to represent it, that'll work. So don't worry if they overlap, it's okay. All right, so temperature, we're going from 5 to 16. We want to use as much of this graph as we can. So again, I'm going to draw a line every sort of 2 spots here. There, there. Okay. Move this over a little bit. All right, if I had, I don't know, -5, then 0, 5, 10, 15, it's not great. If I went from -4, -2, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. And I'll put that label back. All right, temperature in degrees C. Okay, so what we're going to do now is use a dot to represent the temperature, and then at the end we can connect the line or connect the dots. So January, the temperature is 4.6. So I find January. And instead of reading off this side over here, now that's rainfall, I'm reading from the temperature side. So 4.6, it's halfway between 4 and 5, so it's going to be in here somewhere. And I used 2 dots, or 2 bars to represent January. So I'm going to put that dot in the middle of the 2 bars, just to make it look a little nicer. Just a sheer coincidence that the actual precipitation and the temperature value lined up on top of one another. Don't think that it needs to be that way. Just kind of the luck of how I did it. All right, so we went from 4.6 in January. February is 5.9. So I find February. Here's 5.9 is just below 6. So you draw another dot there. Perfect. February. March 7.4. So 6, 7.4, halfway to 8. And you just keep doing that until you get all 12 values on there. And then once you've got them, you can connect them with a line if you want. You don't have to. It's probably going to look something like that. Once you're done, and there you go. You've drawn your climatograph. One thing I forgot to put down here is month. So we know what those letters represent. And there's your climatograph. So I'm just gonna leave the rest for you guys. I mean, once you get it set up, they're pretty straightforward. Make sure you have temperature on one side, precipitation on the other, month along the bottom. And you can go for there. Does anyone have any questions about that before I leave it and move on to the rest of the notes? Moving forward. Give us a second. Don't see anything. So we'll just continue on. If something comes up along the way, just let me know. We can always go back. But for now, we will continue on. So we were talking about climatographs, abiotic and biotic factors. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about biotic factors. So we're going to talk about adaptations. And now this is, again, lining up with your notes as part of the learning guide. So we're in the adaptation section. We'll give you a second to kind of find that if you can. So when we talk about animals live in places, you ask a question like, well, why doesn't something like a, I don't know, really colorful tropical bird like a macaw or a toucan, why doesn't a toucan live in British Columbia? What's wrong with British Columbia? Why doesn't it live here? Why can't animals just live everywhere? Why do like polar bears only live, you know, on tundra and polar ice? What's special about them that only allows them to live there? What's special about the environment? So when you start thinking about, you know, why animals live where they do, we start looking at sort of adaptations that these animals have that makes them specially adapted to live in the environments that they do live in. Now there's examples which we'll look at later on as to animals that are kind of introduced. So we talk about like the European starling and things like that. These are animals that, you know, used to live somewhere and then they've been introduced somewhere and they're become an invasive species. And we'll look at lots and lots of examples of invasive species. So they've adapted to the climate, and we're going to look at the adaptations right now. So the example here, a cactus lives in a desert. Why? Why does cactus live there? Why can't it live where we live? Well, cacti have adapted to live in very low water environments. If you give cactus a lot of water, if you've ever had, a cactus as a plant in your house, you overwater it, it dies. It doesn't need barely any water at all. And cactus can actually perform photosynthesis with half the amount of water of regular photosynthesis, about half. It's a special adaptation that cactus have. Caribou live in the tundra. They're specially adapted, so that's the idea. And there's something special about the organism that allows it to survive in that environment. So we talk about the three different types of adaptations: the structural adaptation, a physiological adaptation, and a behavioral adaptation. So these are the three categories of adaptations, and we'll look at examples in a second. So a structural adaptation kind of sounds like structure, has to do with how the thing is built, how it's made. So if you look at a wolf, it has large paws to help it run in the snow. That's part of its environment. It snows in the winter. It can walk on top of the snow with its large paws. So that is a structural adaptation. Its paws are big to allow it to walk in the snow. If we look at the same wolf, a physiological adaptation is kind of like a chemical event inside the body. So think of sort of chemicals being involved and sort of internal processes that exist inside a living thing that allows it to survive in its environment. So physiological adaptation is a wolf being able to maintain constant body temperature year-round. Even in the cold winter, it can maintain a constant body temperature. That's good if you don't want to freeze. The third adaptation is a behavioral, something it does to survive. So wolf packs will hunt prey, and because they are hunting in a large group, that is something that they do. It's a behavior that a wolf does, and that allows it to survive, allows it to find food and live like that. So let's look at some examples of some of these adaptations. So I have an image here, and there's lots of things going on in here, so I'm not really too picky about what you choose, but can you name any adaptation going on in this image? It can be from it's not a cheetah, is it? Might be a cheetah. I don't know. Doesn't look like a tiger. Is it a leopard? A leopard. We'll go with leopard. We've got a leopard and a porcupine. So Alex, pokey spikes to stop you from getting murdered. Yes. So we have the porcupine has these quills. They grow. It's a structural adaptation. So Damon has given us the okay to call it a leopard. I like it. We'll call it a leopard. So what are there any other adaptations you can see in the picture? And do you kind of know what type of adaptation it is? So porcupine's defending itself with its quills. For sure, we'd call it a structural adaptation. Is there any other adaptations you can see? Maybe on the leopard. The leopard has teeth to rip its enemies limb from limb. This is true. It has very large, sharp teeth, and when we look at like skeletons of animals, you can tell what the animal ate based on what its teeth look like. So when we look at skeletons of dinosaurs, fossils, we can say, okay, Tyrannosaurus rex had really pointy, sharp teeth. Well, you need really pointy, sharp teeth to eat meat. And if you have those pointy, sharp teeth, you are a meat eater. If you could imagine a cow or like a horse or even the back molars that we possess, if you look at those type of teeth, you can establish if they have no pointy, sharp teeth in their mouth, whatever the animal was, well, it was a herbivore. It ate plants. So that's how we know what dinosaurs ate based on their teeth. It's not attacking, but stalking. Yeah, so that's what type of adaptation, Devin, or anyone, stalking? Are we talking about a structural, a physiological, or a structural, physiological, or behavioral. Omnivores, like us, Alex, we have sharp canines in the front and then flat molars in the back. So omnivores like bears and things, flat teeth in the back, pointy teeth in the front. So we can tear meat at the front, chew our veg in the back. Devin says that stalking is a behavioral adaptation. I would agree with that. We can look at the leopards, the actual fur and how those spots are. So instead of being like a solid color, the leopard has these spots all over its body, and when you look at it next to a road, it looks pretty obvious, it kind of sticks out. But if you were to look at it in the forest, that pattern would break up the leopard and it would blend in. So that would be a structural adaptation that the leopard would have based on its camouflage to be stealth. So the one thing I'm kind of blocking here, I'll get out of the way. Leopards have these really long tails, and you can see it here. And when a leopard runs, there's some really cool videos of cheetahs running in slow motion on YouTube that you've probably seen before, but their tails are flying all over the place. Even if you have a dog or a cat at home, that tail is a structural adaptation. It helps the leopard or whatever has the tail balance, run really fast. Leopards have really large muscles, they're fast, very agile. Porcupine, on the other hand, the porcupine isn't winning any records for racing. It has really short legs, so it can't move very quickly, but it doesn't need to because it has this defense mechanism, this structural adaptation on its back. So when you start looking at animals and breaking them down in terms of their adaptations, even just looking at a leopard, there's literally hundreds of things going on here. You have sharp teeth, great eyesight, they can see really well at night. You have that tail, really long legs, big paws for balance, sharp claws. These are all structural adaptations that leopard has. How about this guy here? I don't know what type of snake this is, but you can see there's a few things going on. What type of adaptations are we looking at with this snake? There are probably about 5 or 6 I can think of by just looking at the image right here. So venom. What do we think about venom? What type of adaptation is venom? Structural, behavioral, physiological. Go with that. Terrifying his prey into submission. Actually, it looks like a hand is holding him, so I don't think he's terrifying anyone. So venom and fangs, we're talking about 2 different adaptations there. The venom is definitely a physiological. It's a chemical that the snake produces. So snakes, scorpions, spiders, some other animals, they produce venom. And that is a physiological adaptation. It's a chemical they produce. When we talk about a fang, those really sharp fangs, they're pointed, they have sharp tips, they're hollow, so they can put the venom into the prey. That's a structural adaptation. It's something that's designed on the structure of a snake. Snakes don't have teeth other than fangs, and some don't even have that. They eat their prey whole. So Alex was getting to the next one I was thinking about is snakes can actually unhinge their jaw. So you have your jaw, like we just talked, but snakes can unhinge their jaw and swallow their prey whole. So that is a structural adaptation. They can unhinge their jaw, consume their prey whole. Yeah, and you could maybe even argue that like a snake that eats something whole, that's perhaps a sort of a behavioral adaptation that would allow the animal to eat, every so many days. You don't have to constantly eat. Humans, we eat 3 meals a day, but a snake, if it, gets a rodent and it's a fairly small snake, it would last for, a few days without, consuming food. Haley, what type of snake do you have at home? I don't know a ton about snakes, but there's lots. Every time I go to the pet store, I'm always fascinated by all the cool reptiles and animals. A gopher snake, how big is it? He eats every 10 days. She eats every 10 days. Do you mind telling us what she eats? I don't know anything about snakes. Do you feed her crickets or mice? How big is she? I'm fascinated. Haley, of all the people in the class to have a snake, I would not picture you to have the snake, but I'm really happy that you do. 36 inches, so that's 3 feet. That's pretty long. And you feed her mice. So she eats 1 mouse every 10 days. that right? That seems like a pretty good little diet of mice. Cool. All right, so there you go, snakes. Do you touch it? I'm probably thinking she does. Like, that's her pet. Just like you had a pet dog, you'd pet it, or a cat, you'd pet it. All right, how about this guy? Does anyone know what this is called? This is one of these really cool sort of fish that we've only discovered in the last few years. You need bunnies. This fish was actually, it's the mean fish from Finding Nemo. That was the example I was going to use. It's called an anglerfish, and it has this really long stem on its head, and at the end of it, it has this light, and these fish live at the very bottoms of the ocean, the deepest, darkest places. There's absolutely no light down there. So after about a kilometer of ocean water, light can't penetrate anymore, and you have literally pitch black, no light down there. So what it does is it has this little luminescent light on its head, and it starts blinking it. And then all of these other sort of fish down there, it's completely dark. They see the light, and then they go towards the light, and then it just chomps on them. So bioluminescence, yeah. I'll take it. So what type of adaptations are we talking about here with this very ugly looking anglerfish? And they are hideous. Obviously the light. What type of adaptation do you think the light is? What are we thinking? It could be a couple different things depending on how you define it. Huge mouth. So it has a big mouth, which would probably increase its chances of getting small fish in there. So you have this big mouth as a structural adaptation. The sharp pointed teeth to, once it gets its prey, it kills it probably instantly. Those pierce it. So that's another structural type thing. The light attracts prey for sure. What are we going to call that in terms of adaptation? I think Devin's on it here. So we're talking about, I would say the actual creation of the light is a physiological, it's a chemical process going on, but the structure, the kind of, anchor thing that's coming off the guy's head with the blinking light at the end, that'd probably be more of a structural adaptation. So we have kind of two things going on. You have a bit of physiological, a bit of structural happening at the same time. You notice it has really small little flippers on the side. It probably doesn't swim that fast. Its tail fin's kind of small compared to most fish. It doesn't have like huge muscles. Like, you ever seen a tuna? They're huge, just thick muscle. It doesn't need to be camouflaged, interestingly, because there's no light down there. Nothing can see it. He literally, or she in this case, is the only light creating object for kilometers. So pretty crazy. Possibly the same texture as a rock. I don't know. Never felt one before. This is from a Planet Earth video. I don't know if you've ever seen Planet Earth. That blue thing, believe it or not, is a bird. And when it puts its little plumage down, it looks like just a regular bird. But it's doing this kind of dance thing. What do we think's going on here? We have a couple different adaptations happening here. That's the male of the species, the blue and black one, and then the female is the other one. So we have a mating dance. So that is helping it survive by passing off its genetic material, creating offspring. So what are we going to call that in terms of an adaptation? The face is scary. It is a bit intimidating, I suppose. I love the Planet Earth videos for the birds of paradise. All right, so we have a behavioral adaptation. The mating dance itself is a behavioral. And then you have the actual blue and the dots and all these feathers. That's going to be a structural type adaptation. Interesting, if you look at most species of bird, the males have this beautiful plumage and the females kind of, have sort of more of a camouflage look to them so they can fit in and hide in their nests and things like that. So a couple things going on. This is me before I was married, trying to find a mate. I don't know how this made it in here. There it is. Imagine if humans had like mating rituals like birds. Wouldn't that be a strange occurrence? Walking down the street, see a person standing there, and then they start doing the little dance. That'd be hilarious if that actually happened in real life to humans. All right. I just can't get enough of these birds. You can see this one. It has these really long feathers on its head and has this kind of shiny neck thing, and they do this weird dance. So if you've never seen any of the Planet Earth videos, these are the birds of paradise. They live on sort of tropical islands. And there's literally like hundreds of these birds that have these really, really weird sort of plumages and things. So the dancing aspect is a behavioral type thing. You have lots of structural adaptations in terms of shiny feathers and things like that. Helps them find mates. Has anyone ever heard of these monkeys that live in Japan? They live in an area that's kind of like seismically active, and there's this hot spring that is there, and these monkeys have actually adapted. It's just a unique sort of group of monkeys, so a unique group. This doesn't happen all over the place, but just in this one spot where these monkeys, they live in this hot spring. And then there's like a hierarchy to the monkeys, and if you're one of the most powerful monkeys, you get to sit in the hot tub all the time. If you're kind of lower, a younger monkey or weak or something like that, you don't get to come in the hot tub. And I say a hot tub, a hot spring, I guess I should say. And their whole sort of cultures, when it gets really cold in the mountains, they go and they just hang out in this hot spring. And they've kind of adapted in terms of their behavior to live in the hot spring to survive sort of cold winters. Exactly, so Devin, you've heard of them before. And I mean, it's just something that's happened recently. They haven't been doing this for thousands of years, but there's this hot spring, and I don't know, all of a sudden one monkey says, hey, it's kind of warm in there. I'm just gonna stay in there while it's cold out and it's easier to survive. And Netflix, there's a monkey documentary. All right, I don't know which one's the king. Probably the biggest one. It's usually how these monkeys work. Now, this next section is full of text, and I want you guys to get the notes, but I couldn't really think of a better way to give them to you. So I'm going to kind of cruise through this, and I know there's not a ton of writing involved with it, but I just want you to kind of make sure you're kind of keeping up with the notes. So much of the Earth's biosphere contains freshwater and oceans. Nearly all of the oxygen we breathe, about 75%, of the oxygen we breathe comes from oceans. So when we talk about biomes in Science 10, we aren't going to talk about the oceans. We're only going to talk about terrestrial biomes. So the oceans are extremely important in terms of the precipitation they create. They are the source of life in terms of oxygen, and a lot of food chains, even terrestrial food chains, start in the ocean. If you think about just even around us, there's lots of salmon that spawn. If you go to maybe the Shuswaps or Maple Lake, Sugar Lake, salmon spawn all the way from the ocean, all the way from Vancouver. They swim up the Fraser, and they swim up the Thompson, and they go into the Shuswap Lake, and they go to like Maple Lake, Enderby area, and then they die every year. And that is one of the large sort of parts of the food chain. So these fish feed things like wolves and coyotes and bears and birds and a lot of animals in the forest. Eat these fish. So they start in the ocean, the food chain starts there. You start with your plankton, then something eats the plankton, and the plankton gets eaten by something bigger, and then you get a salmon that eats that. So the food chain originated in the oceans, and a lot of the food chains will start there. So when you look at biomes online or even in the course, there is different breakdowns of the biomes. Sometimes we'll see 8, so in our course we see 8, but there can be 11, 16, just depends on what you are using to classify the biome. So there's no sort of universally accepted definition of a biome. Depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about, the rainfall and the temperature and, how fertile the soil is perhaps, you're going to define one type of biome. And then you can do that, just temperature and precipitation. Maybe you don't have as many biomes now. So you can define them on what type of plants grow in there. So when we talk about adaptations like we just did, we don't necessarily need to talk about mammals and animals and things like that. We can talk about plants that have adaptations as well. Plants can have structural adaptations like a flower brings in insects to pollinate it, to produce more seeds. Something like a Venus flytrap, if you ever heard of them. They live in really nitrogen deficient soil. So if there's no nitrogen in the soil, Venus flytraps will live. They'll catch flies. So that's a physiological adaptation. They have really thick, sort of sappy nectar inside their little containers, and then they close shut. That's a structural adaptation. So we have lots of different adaptations in the plant world as well. Again, apologize, I didn't put any fancy pictures in here, but biomes are complex because of all of the interactions that are taking place between the abiotic and biotic, so the living and the non-living, things like rainfall, soil, non-living, things like plants and animals, bacteria, these are all considered living things. And if you can understand how the interactions occur, then you can better understand how the biome is defined, so where it is and why it's there. Are Venus flytraps, sorry, I'm just trying to read chat at the same time. Are Venus flytraps conscious? No, they just have little, kind of like almost a spring. As soon as something touches them, they know to close. I wouldn't say they're conscious. I could be wrong on that. And vines, as they grow, they spin around, and yeah, until they find something to latch onto. If you've ever seen them, they just kind of go in these big circles. If you ever seen they take like a time lapse sort of thing, and then they speed it up really fast. They go in really big circles until it runs into something, boom, and then it just kind of wraps around that thing. Pretty cool. They know to close, but don't have to be conscious to know something. They don't know, they feel. So it's kind of, if you think about, like if you set a trap with like a spring or something, is the spring conscious? No, but if it's disturbed, the energy is released. So same sort of idea, I guess, with these plants. All right, so we're gonna look at all 8 biomes really quickly, and the notes kind of go along, and I was gonna do a bit of a project with this, but I'm thinking because we had so many interruptions in the first 2 weeks, I don't want to waste any more time because we don't have a ton of time. There's lots of really cool stuff we can spend time on, and in my opinion, biomes maybe aren't the most interesting. So we're gonna look at the tundra. We're gonna look at all 8 biomes. Hopefully we can get them done before the end of the block here. And we're gonna talk a little bit about why the biome is there, sort of what's special about the biome, why the biome exists. So the example here is the tundra. And tundra, you can see, is unique to the northern hemisphere. There's no tundra in the southern hemisphere. It just so happens that most of the landmass happens to be in the northern hemisphere. So it's this pink area. And the tundra is the area that kind of borders on permanent ice and generally boreal forest. So it's somewhere in between the permanent ice and the boreal forest. If you look at the climatograph, you can see that it's relatively low amounts of precipitation. You're only looking at about 20 millimeters maximum of rain. So it's almost really close to being like a desert, not a ton of precipitation. And then the temperature range is really cold. So you're looking at about -30. And in the summer, you're only getting up to 0 for about a month of the year. So this is the 0 sort of gets up to just under 5 degrees in the middle of summer. So these areas are very far north, and you end up with cold climates. So of course, I'm not going to read all of this out to you. I think there's a few of the fill-in-the-blank style things at the very top. I don't know where they are. Like I said, I should probably underline them or something, but not that organized. So, physical features of the tundra. It has permafrost in it, so the ground's frozen year-round. And this is kind of one of these big issues with global warming or climate change is as our planet gets warmer, tundra is starting to melt. And tundra has captured literally thousands and millions of tons of CO2. And as it starts to melt, it's releasing the CO2, which is speeding up the greenhouse gas process, and we end up heating up faster. Sometimes you get swampy pools in the summer. No trees growing here because there's no real growing season to speak of. Basically, you have plants that grow very close to the ground because that's kind of where all the warmth is in the winter because it's always freezing. So even though it's very cold in the tundra, plants still grow there. You have things like lichens and mosses. You get some flowering plants that'll grow in the summer. There's lots of insects there because of the sort of boggy marshes that grow in the summer. Animal adaptations, you're going to have things with really thick fur, like foxes, caribou. You have really short legs. So if you've ever seen a fox, foxes have short legs. They live in cold climates, especially Arctic foxes. They have white fur, helps them blend in the snow. So these are some of the adaptations that they have. Caribou, they migrate depending on where the food source is. And there you go. So that's tundra. Boreal forest. This is technically where we live. So Fort Nelson, BC, up northern BC, is a great example of a boreal forest. What do you think when you look at the climatograph? What's a little bit different in the climatograph from the boreal forest compared to the tundra? I mean, these biomes border one another. So what are kind of the big differences that you see in the tundra and the boreal forest in terms of their climatographs? What's going on here? Why is the boreal forest and not tundra? Why don't we just call them both tundra or both boreal forests? What's special about a boreal forest? And again, we show these kind of lines on a map and we say, if you're here, you're in the tundra. If you're here, you're in the boreal forest. But in reality, it's not a distinct line. It's not like you're walking along and then all of a sudden you get into the boreal forest. You're like, oh, there's the tundra, here's the boreal forest. No, there's transitions, right? You're not going to have permanently frozen ground and then the next step you take, now you're in a really lush forest with lots of trees and the soil is not frozen and things like that. So rain and temperature are the huge ones. And you'll see that you get a lot more rainfall. So 20 mils was the tundra, kind of year round. That was the max. Now we're getting up to 80, so about 4 times as much rain. And the temperature range is a lot bigger too. You're from minus 20-ish all the way up to an average about 15. So you're looking at about a 35-degree swing in temperature. Why don't we just call all biomes Earth? We do. We call it the biosphere, and that is Earth. All right, so the boreal forest, located in the northern hemisphere only. All of the boreal forest is between 45 and 65 degrees latitude. It's in the notes there. It kind of goes across Canada and Russia. It's the largest biome in the world. In Russia, it's called taiga. So if you see taiga somewhere, that's what it's referring to. A little bit about the physical features. You get seasons, short growing season in the summer. You have trees, terrain's rough, lots of marshes, lakes, things like that. Soil's usually wet. Plants in the boreal forest is generally made of cones. So pine cones, we call them conifers, coniferous trees. Spruce, that sort of thing. Pointed waxy needles, prevents water loss. There you go. And then animal adaptations. You have lots of insects, which means birds there to eat the insects. A lot of animals will migrate sort of north-south depending on the season. Some stay year-round. Large-bodied animals, things like moose and caribou and deer. I think deer is the worst example of an animal to use because deer live everywhere except like tundra and permanent ice. I was in Costa Rica and I entered this wildlife preserve. It was right on the ocean. It's called Manuel Antonio. I'm in this sort of jungle, and Costa Rica is incredibly diverse in how many animal species live there. So I got off the bus. There's these trails, so I start walking. The first animal I see in this jungle, tropical rainforest jungle, there's this deer just standing there. I'm like, I flew however many hours, we're talking like an 8-hour plane ride to get to this beautiful, lush tropical rainforest, and the first animal I see is something that I have like 100 of in my yard where I live, trying to eat my plants and my trees, and I'm just like, oh, deer, how disappointing is that? So anyways, deer, they live everywhere. They live in the boreal forest, they live deciduous forests, they live in rainforests, temperate rainforests, they live everywhere. They're very adapted. So that's boreal forest. Temperate deciduous forest. You'll notice that the temperate deciduous forest gets kind of a little bit more rain, sort of kind of continuously. And the temperature range is a little bit warmer in the temperate deciduous forest compared to the boreal forest. But generally speaking, they're very, very similar. When we talk about deciduous, we have trees that have, leaves that fall off. That's kind of it. So the idea here is I'm going to talk about all 8 biomes, and I don't need you to memorize the biomes. I don't need you to memorize, the deciduous forest has this temperature and this amount of precipitation. That's not important. You need to be able to compare biomes to kind of establish what biome you're looking at. So if I gave you 2 climatographs, could you identify one as being a desert and one as being a rainforest? Or can you sort of compare differences between biomes? So sometimes on a test, like a provincial exam or even the tests in the course, you'll get a climatograph, and there'll be no title on it, and we'll say, what biome is this? And you'll have to look at it and you'll be like, well, usually we pick fairly obvious ones. But when you're talking about the differences between a rainforest, like a deciduous forest, and a boreal forest, it can be really hard to kind of figure out which one's which. So you need to kind of establish which one compares to another one and kind of make an educated decision based on that. Permanent rain, not that I'm aware of. So temperate deciduous forests. Temperate means the temperatures are a little bit warmer. We're talking about eastern US, Canada, Asia, Western Europe. So you get a little bit more rainfall in a deciduous forest. It's a little bit warmer. Your temperature swings a bit bigger, minus 30 to 30. You have very distinct seasons here, just like the boreal forest. Plants grow in layers, so you have the sort of taller trees with leaves, form a canopy. Then you have sort of an understory, and then you have things that grow on the ground. And then mosses, things like that. We talked a little bit about the leaves fall off in the winter so the branches don't break on the trees. So that is the temperate deciduous forest. And then animal adaptations. Because there's so many layers to the forest, there's lots of animals that live there. Lots of small mammals, rabbits, squirrels, skunks, cougars, deers, foxes, wolves, bears. Amphibians, they get a lot of rainfall, so you can have lots of frogs, salamanders, things like that. Lots of birds, because the deciduous trees have seeds. And there you go. Some of the birds migrate. Temperate rainforest. This is kind of a really, really highly specific biome. And you'll notice the temperature is almost constant year-round. It only fluctuates between about 15 and 5, so you have about a 10-degree swing, whereas the temperate deciduous forest had a 60-degree swing. You had minus 30 to 30. So we have much smaller temperature variation here. And you see the rainfall is extremely high. So we're talking 4 meters of rain a year. Some of the months. I've been to Pachena Point, actually. It's on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Started hiking the West Coast Trail from there. Pretty cool place. So what makes it special? We have highly specialized biome. So it has to be close to an ocean current. That's why it has really high amounts of precipitation. Temperature is really constant. So being next to an ocean kind of gives it this consistent temperature. Very high amounts of rainfall in the most of the year except for the summer, I guess the drier months. Extremely diverse in plants and animals because of all that rainfall. What else is special that I'm missing? Trees go very tall. So temperate rainforests, generally speaking, have the tallest trees in the world. If you look, the temperate rainforest kind of extends down to towards Northern California. It stops a little bit above it, but Oregon, Northern California, you have redwoods. Vancouver Island and the coast have these spruce trees, the Sitkas and things like that are extremely tall. Most animals live on the forest floor, so they don't live in the kind of the canopy or the higher levels like they did in the deciduous forest. Lots of insects, lots of decaying matter, and that is the temperate rainforest. Grassland is by far the worst biome. Alex, you asked what's the best? I don't know. But grassland is just boring. It has extremely diverse amounts of animals that live there for what it is, but I don't know if you've ever driven through the prairies of British Columbia or the prairies of British Columbia, the prairies of Canada. You know, you get like through the Rockies and you drive into Calgary and then it's just flat. You have like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, just flat grass, no mountains. Kind of boring, if you ask me. So rainfall is relatively low. It's kind of consistent. Big temperature shifts. So we have temperature ranging from about -10 to about 20 degrees. So that's a pretty big shift in temperature. Not a ton of rainfall. So that's what kind of makes a grassland a grassland. If it got more rainfall, it would be a forest. If it got less rainfall, it would be a desert. So a grassland is what we call a transition biome. It's always, not always, it's nearly always found between a desert and a forest. It's kind of what separates a desert and forest. More rainfall, you get forest. Less rainfall, you get desert. So they're all over the place on all the continents. We call them prairies as well in North America and steppes in Russia. They're fairly specific in their location. Not a ton of rainfall. Temperatures somewhat varies. The soil's not very rich because there's not a lot of plants to decompose, just grasses. Plant adaptations. So plants generally grow fairly close to the ground. You can't have really rigid plants in the grasslands because the wind will blow them over and they'll break. The soil's not great, so they can't anchor really deeply. So you end up with grasses. Lots of pollinated flowers and grasses and things like that. And this is where all the kind of cool animals live. If you think about Africa and going on a safari, you know, all of these large land mammals live there because there's lots of grass to eat for them. And there's really sort of big animals there because there's no trees to navigate through or anything like that. And so you get lions, cheetahs, leopards, antelope, giraffes, zebras, elephants, horses, kangaroos, wolves, and then things that live in the ground. So prairie dogs, mice, rodents. They burrow. Grasslands generally get big fires. Extreme weather. There you go. Those grasslands. Tropical rainforest. You asked what's my favorite biome. I think the tropical rainforest is my favorite biome, Alex. Look at the temperature in the tropical rainforest. It is almost completely horizontal. There is very little variation in temperature in a rainforest. It's, you know, the rainforests exist where they do because they're in the tropics. They're between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. They have extremely consistent temperatures and extremely high amounts of rain. So we end up with extremely diverse amounts of plants and animals. I mentioned I went to Costa Rica a long, long time ago. Costa Rica is a very small little place. I wonder if I can find it on the map. You can't really see it. It's not really worth mentioning, but it's right about here, just above Panama in Central America. See my little cursor down here. And Costa Rica has about just under 1.5% of the Earth's land population. So we're talking about terrestrial biomes. Costa Rica's just over 1% of the total land mass of the planet, yet this tiny little country has 15% of the biodiversity of plants and animals in the world. So 1%-ish of the land mass and 15% of the plant and animal species. That's what tropical rainforests are like. They have this amazing variety of plants and animals. Pretty cool places. So they get tons of rainfall, which helps plants grow. And let's talk a little bit about what makes them special. They're in the tropics, that's why they're tropical. You get tons of rain. I think Alex asked, does anywhere get more than 5 meters a year? You can see the rain's fairly consistent here, around 250 centimeters a year. There's not a ton of soil to speak of because the rain washes it away. So basically there's a lot of plants in the rainforest that live off of other plants, which is kind of cool. There's not a ton of sunlight that makes it through the canopy down to the ground, so you don't have a lot of plants on the ground. You do get some, but not a ton. There's the largest amount of plant species. They grow in lots of layers. And then you have these kind of plants like orchids and vines that grow on other plants that are tall, so they don't have to be quite as tall. Not a ton of leaves on the plants because they break under all the heavy rain. So they have kind of thin leaves, not the big kind of, maple leaves in Canada can be these huge leaves. You don't get that in the tropical rainforest. Unless it serves a purpose like a banana tree has these big round leaves that collect rainwater for that plant. So not only does the rainforest have the greatest diversity of plants, but also animals. It doesn't have a ton of large mammals, but lots of animals that live in trees. So you have a ton of variety of birds. These are these crazy tropical birds that we looked at earlier. You end up with lots of kind of land mammal type things that live on the ground. Three-toed sloth. I gotta tell you my sloth story. So when I was in Costa Rica, the last day I was in Costa Rica, I was leaving the next morning very early to fly back to Canada. And I'm in the middle of a city called San Jose, which is the capital of Costa Rica. It's a big city. I'm thinking close to 1 million people live there. Imagine being in the middle of Vancouver. So here I am, I'm asleep because I had to wake up extremely early the next morning, like 3 or 4 in the morning to get to the airport. And so I'm sleeping at pretty early, but sleeping nonetheless. And there's a ton of noise going on outside my room. So I'm like, whatever, it's just people, they'll pass through and it'll just be like, quiet in a little bit. So I kind of waited, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, still a ton of noise outside. So I'm like, okay. So I'm, sleeping, I get up, I open the door to my room, and there's probably about 15 people standing looking at my door. And I'm just like, what the heck's going on? Where are all these people come from, and why are they standing outside of my door? It's, probably like 8 or 9 at night. So I'm kind of looking, they're looking at me, and then I look at them, we kind of have a moment, and then I'm like, what's going on? And then I look right next to me, and there's kind of 2 doors next to each other. So I opened my door, and right next to my door was another door, and there was a three-toed sloth holding on to the doorknob in the middle of this hotel. It kind of had like an open layout and a foyer and stuff, but in the middle of a big city, there's just a sloth hanging on this doorknob. I know, it's kind of nice. It's just chilling there. So you don't want to touch them because they're wild animals and things like that. So the owner of the hotel, after everyone looking at the sloth and taking pictures and stuff, the owner of the hotel brought over a ladder and kind of took the sloth's hands and put it on the ladder and then carried the ladder out into the, I wouldn't even call it forest. We're in the middle of a city, but moved it out into where there are some trees for it to climb up. And yeah, we saw lots of sloths there. Easy to spot because they're not going anywhere in a hurry. Saw one kind of crawling along the road, and yeah, people kind of just, say, here you go, sloth, and put them on a tree or something. So yeah, they're pretty interesting animals. They don't move a lot, and they eat eucalyptus, which kind of is kind of like a psychological drug for them almost. All right, I think this is the last one, permanent ice. So permanent ice, you can see, is permanently cold. It's always below 0 in this biome. It never gets above 0. And it gets relatively low amounts of precipitation. So this one's usually fairly easy to spot, kind of a little bit less rainfall than the tundra, colder temperatures. And you'll notice the temperature on our climatograph, instead of having kind of an up hump, it has a down hump. It's kind of like a little valley instead of a mountain. And that's because most of the permanent ice exists in the southern hemisphere, down at the Antarctic. And you'll see Greenland has a bit, and then Baffin Island, our Canadian Baffin Island here, has a little bit as well. So a little bit here, Greenland, and then all of Antarctica down here at the bottom. And you'll notice that the North Pole is missing. Now, can anyone remember why the North Pole would be missing in our definition of our biomes? Why isn't there any permanent ice in the north? Anyone think of that? I'll move on here while you guys type. It's your million-dollar question for the day. Why is the North Pole not on our biome map? What is special about the North Pole? What do we think? Permanent ice, pretty boring. It's amazing the diversity of animals that live there and plants. The North Pole is not actually a landmass. It's just an ice cap. So it's technically not terrestrial because it's just a bunch of ice, like an ice cube floating up at the north pole of our planet. So they estimate in a few years, 10, 20 years, that in the summer there won't be a North Pole. It'll just be a big ocean up there. So there you go. That's why the North Pole is not included, because it's not actually land. It's just a chunk of ice floating up there. People think, oh, permanent ice, no plants could live there. Well, that's kind of true, but it's untrue as well. If you go to Antarctica, Baffin Island, Greenland, there is some land exposed. When glaciers retreat, there's rocks. And we talk a little bit about primary succession later on, but you get a few species of mosses and lichens growing there. So there are plants that grow there. There's lots of animals that live there, but because of the lack of plants, the animals all have to get their food from oceans or water sources. So think of like penguins that live in Antarctica. You get some like polar bears in the northern hemisphere. Sometimes you get like foxes and things like that as well. They can live in these specific biomes. Sometimes mice and things will live there as well. See, even here, there's more than 100 flowering plant species in the permanent ice. So pretty crazy that amount of plant species could live there, but has a very short growing season, and they do. There you go. So animal adaptations, we got polar bears, walruses, seals, Arctic foxes, some insects, penguins, and leopard seals. But generally speaking, all animals that live there will get their food sources from the ocean. All animals that live there will have very thick fat layers, and that keeps them warm because it's so darn cold. So things like walruses don't have ears because that would give them a lot of heat loss, so they stay warm by not having ears. So structural adaptations. They live in big herds, same with penguins, it keeps them warm. Last but not least is the desert. This one's the most obvious, I think, to look at in terms of the climatograph because there's no rainfall and high temperatures. Now, we kind of don't make a distinction between hot and cold deserts in this course, but you can have cold deserts like Antarctica. Some areas of Antarctica can be considered a desert. They get extremely low amounts of precipitation. So if you're defining a desert by the amount of rainfall it receives, then there are areas in Antarctica that don't receive any rainfall. So technically they're a desert. They're just considered a cold desert. So when we talk about deserts, we put hot and cold together. And because the majority of deserts on Earth are kind of these warm deserts, we just say that, deserts are hot and they don't receive rain. But there are cold deserts as well. So just keep that in mind. Temperature is fairly consistent. You have about a 20-degree swing from 15 to 35. It's the hottest, and it receives the least amount of rain. So they're found on every continent. Like technically, Soyuz area is the tip of a desert, the northernmost reaches of the desert, semi-arid desert. Days are very hot, nights are very cold. You can get below 0 degrees at night in a desert. There's generally not a lot of clouds to keep all that heat in, so the heat evaporates at night. and you end up with really cold temperatures at night. Deserts, there's not really a lot to tell you about them. You're probably fairly familiar with them. So plant adaptations, very few plant species. You get cacti, things with really thick stems that conserve water. Roots extend very long distances to collect as much water as possible. I mentioned earlier that cactus actually, use less water when they do photosynthesis than regular plants. So that is a physiological adaptation that cactus have developed. A lot of animals that live in the desert are nocturnal because it's so hot during the day. They don't want to be out and get cooked. You get lots of reptiles that like the warmth because they are unable to regulate their body temperature. So that is kind of deserts in a nutshell. Now, I apologize for talking so much today and going through those biomes. Usually we do a little bit of a project with it, but I didn't want to because we're kind of slowing down here. So that's the end of the section in the course, the 1.1 section on biomes. Now, if you go into the course, I might as well do that while I'm here. Hopefully I'm still logged in. I'm gonna jump over here, jump into Science 10. And if you go to, we're not safety anymore, we're in biomes. So if you go to the kind of the text that's here, and you flip through all this is what I've been going over for the last couple of days. You should fill in all the notes as you go. Unfortunately, this is slow today. When you get to the very end, there is practice. So I'm just going to jump right to the end. You can see when you get into this kind of book thing, there's a table of contents over on the side. All right, so I mentioned before that a lot of science is based in vocabulary. We've talked about a lot of things like physiological adaptations, structural adaptations, abiotic, biotic, precipitation, things you know about, but some things that might be new. So there's this crossword puzzle here, and you can try to pick the biome based on the clue it gives you and then put the biome in. So remember, your biomes are all in your data booklet. You don't have to memorize them, but you should be able to compare them and be able to tell the differences between them. So that's kind of the first crossword puzzle that you should go through that's in that kind of built-in textbook. And then practice number 2, if I'm not mistaken, is a quiz. So this quiz is taken right from the BC Science 10 textbook website. And you can just go through and there's 10 questions. So you can just pick the answers to the questions. Pretty straightforward. And those are the kind of the practice things that are in there. So I encourage you to go through and do those. So we've done that first section now, the biome section in the notes. Mighty slow today. So you should be done the safety unit. If you haven't written that test, I'll send you that password today. A bunch of you submitted the learning guide over the weekend. I thank you for that. We're done biomes. There's kind of 2 practice sections in the biomes textbook thing, and then there's a check your understanding, which is again sort of fill in the blanks. So just kind of go through that as some practice on the vocab. And then we're going to do ecosystems next week. So we don't have any more class this week. Kind of sad. I think we have a few classes that are a bit longer next week though. So we're going to start ecosystems next week. So you should be done up to ecosystems. Ecosystems will take us maybe 2 days. We'll have an assignment and we'll finish that up. So we'll be done this first unit at the end of next week. So you should be done the safety stuff. You should be done your notes and the biome stuff, as well as your learning guide as you kind of are trudging through that. The learning guide has all of the questions, all of the, like a summary of the biomes you can go through. And then the 1.2 notes on ecosystems, we're going to go through next day. So you should be done up to page 27 of your learning guide before next class. So that's where we're at. Does anyone have any questions as to where we are, where we're going, where we need to be? Anything about tomorrow? Anything about climatographs, biomes, biotic, abiotic, structural, physiological, behavioral? anything related to biology? Negative. All right. I'm fairly confident you guys have social studies up here in a couple minutes, so I'm going to just sign off for today. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow at OC. I've never gone to this Experience OC before. I've visited a lot of the labs at OC before, but I've never been to this day. So it's going to be really fun. I'm looking forward to it. And we'll see you guys in the morning at 9 o'clock at OC on KLO Road in Kelowna. And we'll meet you out in the kind of the foyer front thing. Can you bring the safety thing tomorrow? I suppose. You should be able to get it done and submit it today, though, and get your test done. That would be great. So there you have it. Up to page 27 before next day. Everything in the course up to that point should be done. And we'll continue on with ecosystems next week. So I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon. And yeah, get that stuff in. Thanks.